bottom-up economic model is today's topic of discussion, and it is being touted by the Deputy President and his political allies as the solution to Kenya's economic problems. I shall use two examples to explain these concepts better and to help us understand where we're coming from, which is the trickle-down economic model, to the current, or rather the proposed model, which is the bottom-up economic model.
Aristophanes moved through life convinced, rightfully so, that if a doctrine was to be accepted or rejected, all it had to do was to be praised or ridiculed in popular play. That at the end of the day, it is the wiliest of the flatterers that eventually ascends to supreme power. The perks of democracy, right? Since we are here anyway, and we have already begun being flattered, as is the instance every electioneering period, it would as well be in our best interests to understand the flattery. The bottom-up economic model is one of the theories that has been suggested in the race towards the house on the hill. And since your favorite MPs could not really tell you what the bottom-up economy was, or the never before heard of bottom-down economy was, we thought we should take up that burden.
Back in high school, the scene is the entertainment hall. The people sitting at the front are the Form 4s. The people who decide what movie is going to be watched are the Form 4s. The people sitting behind the Form 4s are the Form 3s, and the Form 2s are behind the Form 3s, and the Form 1s are behind the Form 2s. Now, to get to decide what movie is being watched is something you have to labor towards for the duration of, let's say, 3 years until you are a Form 4 yourself. That implies several things. Firstly, the elites, whom we are calling the Form 4s in this example, are very disconnected from the needs of the majority, which would be what the Form 3s, Form 2s, and Form 1s want to watch. Now, that example is an oversimplification of the trickle-down economic model that we are coming from, and it is marked by several characteristics. The first is there are clear goals outlined in any trickle-down model. This is based on the fact that it is derived from a democratic point of view, whereby you have authority, which is given to elected officials, then cascaded to civil servants, eventually cascaded to the public who are in need of those services. Another characteristic is that the trickle-down economic model takes into account cause and effect, a huge assumption considering the disconnect between what the people at the top think the needs of those at the grassroots are. There's also a clear hierarchy of authority, as we've seen in our movie example, and the rules and the policy are instigated and created and approved from the top coming down. Second, another characteristic is that there is also the availing of resources to achieve these policies that have been set by the ruling elite.
While we've been made to think that the top-down economic model and the bottom-up economic model are not in any way, shape or form interlinked, the reality speaks the opposite. The trickle-down effect was suggested, or rather the trickle-down model of economics was suggested by Sir Arthur Lewis way back in 1955, a decorated economist. So the world was at a critical point. This was 10 years post the World War II. We had just ushered in the age of the Cold War. Western economies had yet to recover from the toll that the economies took during the war, and the impoverished in the world were at a higher number than should ever have been. And as such, it was necessary for the world to figure out how to advance economically and restabilize themselves as economies. The model that was suggested by Sir Arthur Lewis was just as relevant back then as it is now. And the core of it was redistribution. Redistribution of the national pie. However, the national pie, Sir Arthur Lewis argued, was a bit too small, unsubstantive to say the least, and it would be folly for us to insist on subdividing something that's unsubstantive. And as such, his emphasis was on grow the national pie, increase its size substantively, and then from there, let us continue to redistribute it. So the idea was to impoverish a section of people, the masses ideally, for a short period of time, with the goodwill to redistribute that wealth much later. So the top-down economic model was vested critically in three things, or rather was vested deeply in three things, three relationships rather. The first was sectoral relationships. So ideally, what do we invest in? Back then, you really didn't have options. It was industry or agriculture. The theory was held together by three critical principles back then. Sectoral relationships. So ideally, what do you want to invest in? The options was agriculture or industry. Sir Arthur was a proponent of industry for the simple reason the return on investment in industry was significantly higher than that in agriculture. And that was a critical thing in order to raise the size of the national pie. Spatial relationships. So you have figured out what you want to invest in, where do you want to invest it. So you had a question of rural versus urban. And when you have that question, the common sense would have been urban. For the simple reason, there are numerous benefits that accrue to industries that focus themselves at a certain place, cluster themselves to say the least. You're looking at agglomeration benefits, you're looking at economies of scale. You have figured out what, you figured out where, the question is how. So that brings us to the third relationship, the social relationship. So how are they running? The elite or the bourgeoisie were tasked with saving and reinvesting in the economy to ensure that there was continuous cash flow that would then employ your proletariats and your masses generally.
Now, the trickle-down economic model has several issues, as I've stated. Firstly, those at the top usually use statutory language, which is very difficult for those at the grassroots whom the policy is supposed to impact to understand. It's very difficult to understand how exactly it is they arrived at certain things, and that is why civic education is such a huge thing in Kenya, because it is non-existent, and without it we can't understand what these people are saying. Another issue is that it ignores the political aspects that implementation requires. In our example, the Form 4s don't really care much about being popular or satisfying anyone, and they assume that everyone will want to watch what they want to watch. And the third is that it states, or rather believes, that those who are creating the policies are the keys to developing and implementing that policy, which is a very, very far thought, which will be further exemplified when I explain the bottom-up economic model.
So to cut a long story short, of course the redistribution did not happen. I think as Kenyans we understand that the national pie grew, that's for sure, but then was not redistributed as was supposed to. It was further used to enrich the elites. The inequalities worsened, and as such, it was necessary for us to find our way back to the drawing board, and that, my friends, was how the bottom-down economic model was formed.
Trade is the solution to Kenya's current economic woes. There has been an issue of where capital is going, and there has been an ongoing assumption, given the startup revolution in Africa, that finding capital is the issue. I posit that finding capital is not the issue. The actual issue is where the capital is going. Now, if we are able to give the capital to entrepreneurs, we are able to create jobs, we are able to improve economic growth, and we are able to have improved governance, because those in trade will in turn demand better policies to facilitate that trade from the government. But if we give the capital to predatory government bureaucracies, we are just going to help them strong arm and centralize their authority, and we're just going to help them also strengthen their vested interests. A bottom-up economic model has three defining characteristics. We have BPIs, which are the basic public investments. We have VAW, which is an acronym for valuing all workers. And we have the third characteristic, which is a fair system. Now, basic public investments are direct injections into what an economy or its people need to grow and thrive. This would be infrastructure, healthcare, education and research, safe spaces, and community development. Valuing all workers implies the setting of a minimum wage that will enable people to be able to live with regard to levels of inflation in the country, or how the monetary system will be at that point in time. And there's also the issue of fair system. How is the distribution being done? Where is the distribution happening? What qualifies you to receive this funding? Now, the bottom-up economic model would be the solution to Kenya's economic woes, because trade, as I've mentioned before, is the solution to boosting and improving an economy. This is based on the pretext that economies are judged based on how fast cash moves, or rather money moves within the economic system. Now, people at the bottom of the economic ladder usually have many immediate needs, and therefore on receipt of cash, it is easily redistributed back into the economy through purchases, through trading with other people, and through debt arrangements they have within that community. Money flowing down rather from the top has several issues, because these people have a very low rate of releasing money. This is because of investing in long-term assets, or holding the money to influence monetary supply and interest rates, or saving the money, or investing in vehicles that will effectively withdraw cash from the economic system.
The bottom-down economic model ideally advocates for rural development and redistribution. It involves investing in very many forms. You're looking at expertise, you're looking at money, you're looking at management and time, and creating favorable policies in small-scale projects that directly involved the rural and urban poor in income-generating projects. The idea revolved around making the masses self-generating in terms of income and self-dependent, such that they did not have to be left at the mercies of market policies and market structures that had impoverished them in the first place because, of course, of the helping hands of the society's elite. Has it been tried before? Because at this point it looks very attractive, and the question is, does it work? Because not everything attractive actually works. Way back in 1978, China was one of the most impoverished countries there was. At least 80% of the population was involved in subsistence farming. Of course, that was not bound to generate a lot of revenue. The greater majority of the population was pauperized. Western civilizations had thought that if anything, China was going to struggle to get to where every other country was, based off of the logical parameters that they had used. Currently, China wages war on US supremacy. China is the second largest economy by virtue of nominal GDP at $15.66 trillion. By virtue of purchasing power parity, it is the largest economy in the world. China's growth rate since 1978 has consistently been above 6%. That, my friends, is a very big deal.
Now, to look at a practical example of where the bottom-up economic model has been able to work, let's look at Nigeria, which is our close cousin in terms of corruption and poor leadership. When Dr. Iweala, who is the current head of the World Trade Organization, was the finance minister in 2016, she initiated a competition known as the You-Win competition. Now, the objective of the competition was to offer 1,200 entrepreneurs an equity grant of $50,000. To measure the impact of this program, they tracked those who received the grant versus those who did not receive the grant over a period of 3 years.
China, in 1978, adopted the bottom-up economic model. Between 1978 and 2005, China experienced the largest and most rapid poverty alleviation scheme in the history of mankind. At least 340 million people transitioned from agriculture into industry and revitalized the entire economy from the bottom up, literally the bottom-up economic model.
Now, the effect of this grant on the economy of Nigeria was actually very positive. They found that 7,000 permanent jobs had been created from those 1,200 entrepreneurs who had been given the amount, which gave us the derivation that to create a permanent real job, we only needed $8,500. Now, that was under the bottom-up economic model.
China's approach was not necessarily purely a bottoms-up approach. The state was involved, perhaps a whole lot more than how you would ideally anticipate in a pure bottom-up economic model. The government acquired funding, went into regulation, put in place pro-profit policies or rather pro-people policies, went for predatory taxes and took them out of the system. So ideally, there was a collective psyche from not just the people on the ground, your masses ideally, but also from the bourgeoisie at the top. Which leaves us to wonder, while of course we'd want to criticize the trickle-down economic model, is it the model or is it the people we've entrusted with the model?
Under the trickle-down model, we recently had a factory built in Kenya for manufacturing of guns, which cost $4 billion, but only offered 100 positions of employment, implying that the real cost of creating a permanent job stands at 40 million in Kenya. Therefore, the bottom-up model does have viability as a plausible model to ensure that we do create real-time employment and we offer people real-time livelihoods within their chosen areas of specialization, if the example from Nigeria is anything to go by. As much as the bottom-up model in an ideal situation would work for developing countries and developing economies, the Kenyan context presents several issues which would make the bottom-up model very difficult to produce the desired effect. The first issue, obviously, is theft and corruption. The key touter of this model has been the deputy president, the second most powerful man in the land, in what is arguably the most corrupt Kenyan regime we have ever had. Therefore, how he will defend this system from the very same vice he has been complicit in is going to be very interesting to see.
Corruption or embezzlement was punishable by death. You're looking at lethal injection, electric chair, you're looking at firing squad. Basically, they were very creative with their methods. Greed was rare. Let's come back home. Kenya has consistently been one of the most corrupt countries in the entire world, and boy oh boy do we excel in corruption Olympics. We are podium finishers every other time. 2 seasons of NYS saga, KEMSA scandal, Mercury Sugar, Golden Bag, Chicken Gate, Land Sugar. I'm sure you're mentioning others.
Taxes are being levied on individuals left and right. There are now proposals to include a limit to how many times you can file nil returns, as if they'll find you a job within 3 years. So it's a very, very interesting aspect to look at. How exactly will the tax regime and the tax policies change to enable the bottom-up model to thrive? Because there is no need to inject cash into the grassroots and then re-inject it into the economy via taxes. You're reducing the purchasing power, you're reducing the disposable income, and that will ultimately shrink the economy. Another issue with the Kenyan context is the bureaucracy and the structure of the distribution of these resource injections. How exactly will it be done?
So now, we want to, as usual, as very many African countries tend to do, borrow systems you have seen work for the West and replicate them in the country. Does it work? What are the logical circumstances around us borrowing them? Kenya has one of the most inefficient tax systems in the entire world. So basically, it's a very toxic cycle of overtaxing, and then underperforming, and then apologizing, and then overtaxing to make up for the underperforming, and the toxic cycle goes on. Despite the promises of fairness in tax and us being asked, jiulize mchango wako kwa serikali ni upi, Kenya has one of the most expensive tax regimes. In fact, has featured strongly every other time in the 5 most expensive tax regimes in Africa. Back to China. The ruling class imposed taxes on the rich. In so doing, they ensured that they could buffer the poor by ensuring that tax cuts were passed through the system. Note the stark difference between the two. One of the things you'll realize is there is a significant difference between the discussions when it comes to the promise of better and matching the energies when it comes to the reevaluation of policies and the actual work that needs to be done into ensuring that the bottom-up approach actually takes root in this country. China's growth was partially financed by debt, but mostly by the returns on the industrial investments that they had made. Now ponder this. One of the key approaches of the bottom-up economy is to invest financially at the bottom, ensure that there is wealth accumulation at the bottom, and then figure out how it's going to work upwards. However, that was not ideally how it was envisioned. A lot of the industries that were invested in the bottom-up approach were not necessarily your most income-generating projects. They were always small projects for people who did not have a lot of financial literacy, a lot of general literacy altogether, who did not have the spoils of capitalism at their disposal. And as such, majority of these products were not necessarily the most expensive, best-doing products in the market. And as such, if we want to invest in a bottom-up approach, as Kenyans whose economy is almost always financed by debt, the question is, how are we expecting to pay that debt? So ideally, for us to realize the kinds of revenues that we need to sustain a borrowing economy on one side and generating the incomes to pay back, that would take years. What then bridges the gap between our adoption of that style of economy, especially in the way it is being sold, as a purely bottom-up economy where there are no elites or bourgeoisie involved? How then do we bridge that gap while we allow for time for the bottom-up economy to actually take root and effect?
An initiative that copied the bottom-up economic model in Kenya was the Kazi kwa Vijana program, whereby after a day of working or a day of intense physical labor, you'd be paid 400 shillings. However, reports on the ground unfortunately showed that most youths are being given 150 shillings, which implies that over 50% was already been stolen. So how exactly will these resource handouts reach the people they're supposed to help create value in the society, create businesses, perform trade, without it being lost to the vagaries of the Kenyan economic system?
The investment theory in the bottom-up economy is ideally the same investment theory that is being used in a lot of the funds that you see today. Look at your youth fund, your Iwezo fund. A lot of them think the same exact way. The concepts are stunningly similar. Invest in a couple of people, especially those that cannot do it for themselves, then go into progress evaluation and monitoring, give them skills, etc., and then see what comes out of it. Hopefully it's going to be good. That is ideally what the bottom-up economic model envisions. And yet, we have done so poorly with these funds. We've done so poorly with this model applied in smaller spaces. Are we really that bold? Are we bold enough to take that model as is, no adjustments, and just carry it and replicate it for an entire country? The long and short of this story is quite simply that development does not have a to-go formula. The reason being, if we had it, we'd not be here at this point. Development does not necessarily trickle down from top to bottom, neither does it effervescence from the bottom to the top. It needs a conglomeration of very many things. It is a synergy between institutions at the top and of course collective psych from the bottom, together with investments and a couple of other things. Ideally, no particular model will get us there. It is always a mix and match of both.